Good day, college students. I'm going to present something to you today that's probably maybe not ever entered your mind per se. We'll see. It's a rather odd topic, but the potential for you to deal with this is pretty high, but is out there, so it has to be considered, and it's part of our curriculum anyway. What is the heading? Possession, shamanism, and healing in Christian counseling. Possession shouldn't shake you up too much. If you're a Christian, you're very familiar with what the Bible speaks about in terms of possession, and we're going to hit a little bit of that as we go through this. Shamanism might be a little off the beaten path for you, but healing and Christian counseling is what we do. If you're a pastor, you heal people, hopefully in spiritual ways, maybe. But just to quickly um, give you some background, my dissertation dealt with demon possession and the lack of it being taken seriously by some psychologists, not knocking the field, but my experience with it and with some pastors, believe it or not, is that there was a lack of belief in demon possession. Uh, that's incorrect. It's not my opinion. It's written in the Bible. Demon possession exists. I even had an argument with a person. I won't give you any details. I will say they were in the ministry, and they basically told me I was a nut. That demon possession didn't exist. So I think there was a question of credentials there. But anyway, let's jump into this with both feet because this could drag out, and I'm going to try not to let it drag out. Um, let's start. Let's divide this into parts. That'll make it simple. Spiritual experiences and counseling. People have spiritual experiences. I've had a couple of visions. Um, I didn't really have, I'm sorry about my voice. I didn't really have a lot of, I hadn't given a lot of thought to visions till I had one. And they're as real as the day is long. Now, psychology would give you excuses for that. Um, and let me run through some of this and kind of get your thinking cap on and deal with this. Human beings historically interpret suffering uh, related to spiritual, physical, psychological, and social perspectives. Uh, and Christian counselors frequently deal with people who talk about spiritual oppression, uh, demonic attacks, ancestral spirits, curses, visions, trance states. I would probably not be going out on a limb if I told you that if I had described the vision that I had, the first one that I had, I had two, but I can't believe it or not, I can't remember the second one. But the first one, when I had that vision, had I gone to a mainstream psychologist, I would have been told, "Oh, you just kind of talked yourself into a trance, or you were emotionally distressed." The emotional distress would have been correct. Talking myself into a trance was not the case. And then some people consider these supernatural experiences. What do we do as counselors to deal with that? Theological understanding, psychological assessment, cultural humility. What does that mean? Take into consideration the culture that they're from, and then our ethical responsibilities to do all that. There are two things we shouldn't do. Don't explain every problem as being demonic. Uh, Demons don't cause all of our problems. Things just happen. I don't have a better excuse than that. Not excuse, but explanation for that. And then dismissing, here's the other thing, dismissing every spiritual experience as mental illness. I would think that if you're a practicing pastor, that probably would not be weighing heavily on your mind. Um, because we do know what demons can do, or we have a fairly good idea, I think. They can do anything. That's why we have to wear the armor of God. So Christian counseling, with these things in mind, revolves around discernment, compassion, and cultural competence. What does that mean? That's in the humility category, knowing the culture of the person you're interacting with, and then evidence-based assessment. Or, it's hard to use the word science when you're talking in Christian terms, but hey, it exists out there, and that's what evidence-based assessment is. Also, give me the background. How did this start? And then theological wisdom, which is something that you all possess, I hope. Shamanism we'll get to in a minute. These things are emotionally charged. They're very spiritually sensitive. They're culturally complex. You're not going to be a professional in the area of a person's culture unless they're from the same culture you're from. So this may be a learning experience for you. But again, humility and discernment, that's what we want to make sure that we have in our toolbox. Every culture develops explanations for suffering, and those include spiritual realities, at least culturally. Some people interpret distress through medical models, some through psychological models, and then a lot through spiritual frameworks. So, as Christian counselors, you'll encounter individuals who believe they're under spiritual attack, or they're oppressed by evil forces, or they're experiencing some supernatural event. What your responsibility is to not react with fear or sensationalism. Don't sensationalize any of that. Respond thoughtfully, compassionately, and ethically. Be careful. I teach a course in ethics. You probably should consider taking that. If you're in the curriculum, you will. You can't spiritualize every mental health issue. You can't automatically dismiss spiritual experiences as pathology. What's pathology? It's another fancy word for diseased. Balanced Christian counseling takes the approach of recognition of complexity of human experience. Human suffering can involve biological, psychological, social, cultural, and spiritual dimensions all rolled into one. So you got to be able to discern this, and you have to use careful assessment. I don't think that you're at a level yet in studies, unless you have a counseling background, to really grasp the discernment part. That's basically a preliminary assessment, and then that leads to a more careful assessment. So bear these in mind as we travel through this, because that's step one into getting you involved in a counseling session where somebody may be presenting these sorts of things. You have to understand part two. You've got to understand possession across cultures. So let's look at this kind of a list of things that we can zero in on where possession belief lives. Christianity, obviously. Some African tradition, the religions related to that. Indigenous traditions. Hinduism, Islam, Caribbean spiritual systems. My dissertation involved Haiti and Trinidad. Asian religious traditions. I've been to Japan a bunch of times as a military guy, and kind of didn't bump heads particularly, but encountered a different kind of belief system, religious belief system. How do we deal with that? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to give you a list of symptoms. So you may want to make sure you remember these. Altered states of consciousness. I want to dwell on this just for a moment. Uh, this is a rather long list, by the way. What's an altered state of consciousness? It's a state of consciousness other than waking consciousness. That's kind of a broad definition. What is sleep? Sleep is an altered state of consciousness. You're basically awake and asleep at the same time. There's some things that you cannot do when you're asleep, and things that you think you can do when you're asleep. There are a lot of things that take place in sleep. Dreaming, of course, is one of them. But an altered state of consciousness simply means that you are not in full waking consciousness. Daydreaming is at a mid level of awareness, and that can be an altered state of consciousness in certain circumstances. Dissociation, that means disconnection with reality. Trance states, I've already discussed that. A trance, what is that? That's entering to a different realm, usually done through hallucinogenic substances. Unusual vocalizations, speaking in tongues sometimes is considered by some to be weird. There are various definitions of what speaking in tongues is. The psychological explanation is that it's an emotional outburst and people just are uttering vocalizations. If you talk to somebody that goes to a particular kind of a church where that's a normal occurrence, they're going to give you their explanation for that. Bible has its own explanation for that. Sudden personality changes. Remember, we're going through a symptoms list here. I won't get very involved in that. Sudden personality changes. You, as a counselor with a client, would have to have established a history, or you would have to have done some background investigation with the family, what changes have taken place, so on and so forth. Fear reactions, self harm behaviors, auditory experiences. What are self harm behaviors? Let me back up. Suicidal inclinations or suicidal vocalizations, anything related to self harm. And then culturally symbolic behaviors. That one's difficult for you if you're not really schooled in a person's culture. And we'll discuss it a little bit. What do you do clinically? What do you consider clinically? I would look right away if I see some dissociation. What pop in my mind would be dissociative identity disorder. If you're not familiar with that, that used to be called multiple personalities. Very quickly, I'm going to give you background information here. It's not necessarily my opinion. Dissociative identity disorder, DID, it's easier to say that, is viewed skeptically by some healthcare professionals. Some view it as an excuse to behave in ways that would normally not be acceptable in that person's own view of what's moral, but yet they have that desire, so they develop this other personality basically as an excuse to go do these things they would normally do. Psychology in general tells you that this is truly a disorder. If you look at the figures, I may have these backwards. If you're dealing with a male, I believe that there can be up to 8 different personalities. Females double that, or it's the other way around. Doesn't matter. The point being that that's a potential that you can't really dismiss professionally and ethically. You have to, if they report that, you have to treat it as though it's real. You can't say, "I get out of here." That's stupid. That's ridiculous. Nobody has that. That's not the way we do our business. So DID, something to consider. Psychosis. This can be dangerous. Psychosis can turn into a pretty bad situation. Don't take it lightly. I'm not going to give you, very sorry about this. I'm not going to give you guidelines about psychosis. That's a whole course. So I would suggest you do some outside reading about psychosis. Um, if you can get your hands on it, and I'm going to mention it again in a minute, get a copy of the DSM. You can even Google that. Another thing to consider: schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Many people are not very well schooled with schizophrenia. There are about 6 or 8 different kinds of schizophrenia. Actually, more than that if you break it down into subcategories. Probably the most disruptive is paranoid schizophrenia. People right away think, oh, they'll go out and kill everybody. That's not the case. Paranoid schizophrenia, the person more likely to harm themselves. And everybody says, oh, yeah, they hear voices. They may. They hear all kind of noises. It's not just a voice. There are various types. Um, there's a type of schizophrenia, and I'm embarrassed because I should know the clinical name for this, and it slipped my mind, where you um, are given secret signals that only you can understand, and secret languages that only you understand. Those can become deadly. I know of a case that I was closely associated with where a gentleman had that type of schizophrenia, and he um, committed a murder because he thought he was told to go do it. Trauma-related dissociation, um, neurological conditions, substance-induced disorders. These are considerations for you. And again, I don't have time to expound on any of those per se. If one of those or several of those interest you, then here's what I suggest you do. And I said I would mention this again. DSM. What is DSM? It's the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. It's in its 5th edition, so you would want to look for DSM 5, Roman numeral 5. It recognizes that spiritual experiences should not automatically be diagnosed as mental illness. They may be culturally normal. So if any of these on this clinical consideration list or any of the common symptoms interest you, then I would strongly suggest that you go to a library or just see if you can get your hands on information from the DSM-5 and put in these things and see what information you get. This doesn't teach you how to cure those things. You can't cure things like that. We as counselors, we aid people in becoming uh, healed as much as can be done. They have to do a lot of the work too. So we'll get into that if you take the course in clinical counseling. Um, but you can diagnose. And so that's what this DSM does. Same as a physician's desk reference. It diagnoses, it doesn't tell you what to do. Maybe more so than the DSM. So, possession beliefs appear in a lot of cultures, all cultures around the world. Interpretations are different. Uh, some traditions describe situations where a spiritual being influences or controls a human person. Is that possible? Bible says this. Christian traditions, and this you probably have way more better understanding of this, say that possession is associated with demonic influence. Indigenous cultures, spirit possession sometimes may be interpreted positively, related to communication with ancestors or being given spiritual guidance. I think that this can go in both directions, good and bad. So we got to understand culture shapes interpretation. What one culture labels as demonic, another may understand it as spiritually positive. Um, if a client, I'm trying to think of examples. If a client reports hearing voices, then you may want to consider schizophrenia, uh, that spectrum, but Is that what you should jump to right away? No. That's why we want to assess and evaluate everything surrounding that. Hearing voices, entering trance states, behaving in ways they can't explain. These are all things that sound like schizophrenia, but don't all automatically think that it is. You have to carefully assess whether those symptoms reflect mental illness, trauma responses, neurological problems. Need to know if there's a history of substance abuse. You also need to know if they're culturally normative behaviors. It could be a combination of everything. Sometimes, for example, trauma victims, trauma survivors in particular, dissociate during stress, step away from reality, in other words, because they can't deal with it. PTSD is one of those deals. Psychotic disorders, those folks that suffer from that may have hallucinations, may have delusions. Delusions are different from illusions. Illusions are visuals. Delusions are thoughts. Thoughts such as delusions of grandeur. You've probably all heard of that. Well, what is it? It's a person thinking that they're grandiose in some area. There was a guy that was just shot in Washington D.C. who had delusion of grandeur. He told everybody he was Jesus, and then he tried to get into the White House, and he had a gun, and now he's not here anymore. So heavy duty stuff like that. And the reason I say that is because I'm gonna flip it. What about sleep deprivation? Substance abuse, we mentioned that, neurological conditions, substance abuse and sleep deprivation. Did sleep studies indicate that after 72 hours of no sleep, you can hallucinate? Not uncommon. There are other things that can take place. It's very damaging not to sleep. So don't use pathology as your assessment necessarily. We don't want to pathologize culturally accepted spiritual experiences. Um, it's very important when you're working cross culturally. You need to do several things, and this is common sense. I don't even really need to tell you this. You need to carefully listen to what they're saying. You need to carefully do an assessment, and then you need to discern, prayerfully discern, rather than jumping to conclusions. Don't do what's known as immediate assumption. It's not going to get you or the client anywhere. Let's run quickly through something you should be very familiar with. Part 3, biblical perspectives related to possession, and then how do we help fix that? Well, you're all familiar with a lot of the areas, I'm sure, in the Bible. Mark 5, with the demoniac who was in the tombs running around. They couldn't even chain him up. Matthew 8, Acts 16. All of these have stories related to demonic activity. I'm not going to try to school you in biblical themes because you already know that. But how about spiritual warfare? We don't seem to spend a lot of time on that necessarily in some cases. The armor of God, I mentioned that earlier. Spiritual struggles, we all have those. What about prayer life? What about facing truth? Being truthful, not hurting people's feelings, but being truthful. And then faith in general. Here's some things I don't want you to do as a Christian counselor. Amateur stuff, including things like exorcism. You may get a chuckle out of that, but believe me, there are people running around out there that think they can overpower demons. Good luck. I won't mention any particular religions. There's some that believe that you can do that. If you read any true articles about that, sometimes those people find out they should have left well enough alone, if you want to call it well enough. Coercive spiritual interventions. Don't coerce anything. We're in the uh, a helping ministry, if you want to call it that. Shaming language. This is something a counselor should never have to be told. You never shame somebody when they bring their problem to you. Reinforcing delusions without assessment. That one's a little odd. If you came to me one day and we had a session and you said, well, I really think I'm Jesus, I'm not going to sit there and run over some kind of odd assessments. That's going to tell me something right away is wrong, but I want to get to the bottom of why. That's where the assessment comes in. And then here's a common sense one. That's the last one I want to put on this list. Neglecting mental health referral. Look, we're not Superman. We need to reach out into our network. If you're going to be doing counseling wherever, one of the first things you need to do is network. You need to find out who's in the area that would be a go-to in terms of referral. When you encounter somebody that has a problem that's beyond your scope of ability, you better refer, because if you don't, you're violating ethical standards and you get in a lot of trouble. So be careful with that. And then we can even consider denominational differences. So take that cautions in the back of your, keep it in the back of your mind. And what about this denominational thing? Can Depends on what your traditions have taught you. Possession can affect behaviors or not. Depends on your belief system. How should you help deliver this person from demonic possession if that's the problem? What's the role of prayer? Is there a role for exorcism? Spiritual gifts. Do I have the gifts to be able to uh, dismiss a demon? I remember the story, you do too, about the demon who whipped about 6 or 7 fellas who were trying to get a demon out of a guy. And he said, I don't know who you are. I know who Jesus is. Don't know who you are. And he just laid a whooping on them. So find out what the spiritual gifts have to say about that. My mind goes away thinking about spiritual gifts. So there's a lot in the Bible about this. That's your go-to, particularly related to possession. Talk quickly about shamanism. You may or may not encounter this. I'll give you a bit of a history behind it and some practices and some worldviews. May surprise you to know the cultures where shamanism is normal. Siberian traditions. Yeah, that's Siberia. Uh, this one won't surprise you. Indigenous North American traditions. They used to call them witch doctors. I don't know if that's a derogatory term. I don't use it, but we call them shamans. Amazonian traditions down in the jungles of Amazon. African tribal systems. Shamanism exists there. Central Asian traditions. Shamans. These are priests. You didn't know that. What are the characteristics? I've mentioned these already. Some of them. Trance states. A lot of times trance states are brought on by hallucinogenic substances, although there are some people who claim to be able to place themselves in a trance just through meditation. I'm not going to argue with them. Then we have external things, drumming, rhythmic chanting, uh, or a person goes on a spirit journey. The Aboriginals in Australia talk about these. There's a thing called healing ritual. Then their use of symbols. And in meditation, or mediation, either one, through spiritual and physical worlds. Mediums. The Bible tells us not to mess with mediums, talking to the dead. That's in the Bible. I can't remember the verse. I'm not good at remembering Bible verses and chapters and books for that matter. I'm sorry. Uh, have a go-to list. So what are your considerations for this? Clients may participate in shamanistic traditions. You have to work that out with them. It's not that easy. I'll cover it again in a moment. You're not going to be doing shaman things. Combine Christian faith with indigenous practices, kind of making a connection. Uh, Clients can experience identity conflict. Here's that dissociative business again. And then they may or may not come to you, and think about that for a minute, because they fear judgment from the church body. So they don't come to you, or they come to you because of that reason, and you got to deal with that clinically. So what do you do? Rejection of all shamanistic practices. Well, that's a starting point, but you don't say, get that out of here. You have to do it gently. Cultural dialogue. You want to speak to them in language that they would be familiar with, for example. And then you want to integrate pastoral approaches, things that you've been taught as a pastor, and then incorporate it with the training you get from our counseling classes. Shamanism's probably one of the oldest, if not the oldest, form of spiritual healing and mediation that exists. And it is greatly differing across cultures. Shamans are looked at as people who can enter altered states, and then they have this ability that the normal person doesn't have to interact with spiritual realities, spiritual entities. And what's it for? It's for healing, guidance, protection. I saw a ceremony not long ago where I don't know what you call him. I guess a shaman of an indigenous North American tribe, and to gain protection for a group that was doing a study, he used tobacco and he would sprinkle it around various places on the ground. He'd say a little prayer about it. So these are practices that I don't know that you deal with it, but you got to be prepared for anything. So you have to be open-minded, right? You have to epoche, remove your biases. Part 5. This is a little tricky, so bear with it. Healing traditions. I want to talk a little bit about that, culturally related too. So, healing traditions. Many combine spiritual, emotional, physical, and communal elements. Humans rarely experience healing in isolation. Communities create rituals, and they create practices that provide meaning during suffering. In our case, in Christianity, healing can involve prayer, worship, confession, anointing with oil, scripture reading, pastoral support, communal engagement. The church gathers around you. Intercessory prayer, that's a common practice, as you well know, for physical healing, but also for emotional healing. From a psychological standpoint, healing rituals can reduce anxiety. They can strengthen social support. They can cause an increase in hope. and it provides us an emotional structure that's supportive during a crisis, an emotional crisis or any kind of crisis for that matter. So there's the science part of that. Christian counselors need to recognize that spiritual practices oftentimes can promote resilience. They can promote coping, prayer, supportive faith community, any of the things that you're familiar with, forgiveness work, putting spiritual meaning into things can often be positive related to mental health. I think that I want to wrap this up um, with two things: psychological and clinical considerations, which you need to know. And then I want to talk a little bit about ethical issues, although you'll get a good dose of that when and if you take the ethical course here. So let's deal right now with psychological and clinical stuff. Sorry. What do we want to start with? We want to evaluate mental status. This is this is the science part of this, so bear with me. Trauma history, very important. Cultural background, very important. Religious beliefs, all of these are very important. Neurological symptoms. You may not be very well schooled in that. And don't go run and get a book and try to school yourself. Refer. Substance abuse and risk of harm, as in suicide. Trauma is a tough one for you. Trauma and or dissociation. Trauma can produce depersonalization. I'm not going to give you definitions for all of this stuff. You can look it up. Dissociation, I've discussed that with you. Memory fragmentation. That's a symptom sometimes of PTSD. Altered consciousness. Emotional numbing. What is this saying? People try to remove themselves from the pain. So be wary of that and be wary of this. Psychosis versus spiritual experience. There's important distinctions that have to be made. Level of impairment. These are things that you may have to do. Reality testing. Cultural consistency. Duration and severity. Dangerous behaviors. Mental stuff can get tricky. Give you an example. If you've ever had a panic attack, one panic attack in your life, you do not have panic disorder. You had a panic attack. Anybody can have a panic attack. What do you need to do as you encounter these evaluations, or I should say, go through these evaluations, perform these evaluations to really help yourself as much as you're helping anyone else and to protect yourself? You should collaborate, share the burden. Who with? Psychiatrists, physicians, clergy, family systems, the social family systems out there, culturally informed professionals, people who are experts in that cultural field. So what are you doing? You're basically seeking all the guidance you can get to help this person. And let's wrap this up with ethics, because all of this stuff you're doing has to be within the realm of ethics. And again, I'm not going to elaborate on all of these because you'll either be taking these courses if you're in the master's program. If you're in the certificate program, you won't necessarily be taking these, but you can use DSM-4, DSM-5, and other legitimate sources to get further information on this. But what are some ethical concerns? Informed consent, avoiding harm, respecting autonomy, client autonomy, cultural competence. That's a big one. You may not have that. Avoiding dual relationships. Look that up. That's there's some serious stuff to be considered there. And then referral when it's necessary. I'm not trained to this level, so I'm referring you to this person. And then you have to be wary of harm, risks of harm, false accusations of possession, re-traumatization, bringing up old things in the wrong way, increasing psychosis, spiritual abuse, coercive exorcism. That word pops up a lot. Here lately, it's popped up more. I don't know what, maybe there's a movie out or something. I don't know. And then family panic. You have to be the calming influence here. You should never impose spiritual interpretations on unwilling clients. That's an ethical violation. And then you have to remain within your competent areas. You have to remain within your competent boundaries. Too many times people overstep that. I think I can do this. No, you know you can or you know you can't. Okie dokie. So if you have any questions, then I would gladly answer your emails to the best of my ability, or I might refer you. Have a good day.